Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is the Sunday show at Hromadske International, the only prime-time show explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Humenyuk. So, safeguarding transatlantic security, to-do list, that is the topic of our program tonight. On the third anniversary of the Maidan revolution and of the third anniversary of the Crimean occupation. So with an extraordinary panel I'll introduce you in a few moments, we'll discuss, is the future of the US and NATO being remapped? What are the myths and facts regarding the bromance between Putin and Trump? What are expectations of Eastern Europe regarding the foreign policy of the United States? And does Ukraine have a pivotal role to play in transatlantic security? There is a lot more to follow, but I'll remind that you can see full versions of all our interviews, as well as our Russian and Ukrainian language content at our webpage, en.hromadske.ua and hromadske.ua, and we'll be back in a second. So I welcome our guests who are the expert on transatlantic relations. So the first would be Lorne, who is a co-director of the Transatlantic Renewal project and founder of Redstone Global and New-Risk practice focused on the political potential of grassroots individuals. And as well, Lorne was the president of the International Republican Institute, and as well an assistant secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor at the US Department of State, and there are a lot more to say. Alina Polyakova is the deputy director of the Eurasia Center and the senior fellow for the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and knows very well the region. She is an author of The Dark Side of European Integration, a monograph that speaks about the rise of the far-right populism. Also, Veronika Víchová is coming here from Czech Republic, from Prague, and is an analyst at Kremlin Watch Program within the European Values think tank. Damir Marusic is the publisher of the American Interest Online, and he writes and regularly contributes to a number of publications with an expertise on Russia, Europe, and Damir as well, I know, has come just from the Baltics, so he has something to add. And of course, James Denton is a co-director of the Transatlantic Renewal project and the editor of the World Affairs Institute Online. So we are happy to start, and I probably would start with a very general question. A lot of you, at least four of you, have just come from the US. We are here in Kyiv, we're really looking, how would you describe the current state of affairs? Of course, we're talking about the foreign policy of the new US administration, with new people coming, with Donald Trump, his team. So, Lorne.
I think all administrations start out by settling in. I think what's been interesting in this administration is the people that he has recruited to do foreign policy for him are very mainstream in their thinking. Tillerson came from outside government, but Mattis is very mainstream. And I expect you're going to see the same from an NSC advisor. I know they have been in Europe this week telling Europeans there are certain things Trump wants, and I think he's very serious about that, things like the 2%. But I think they've also been trying to reassure Europeans we're not walking away from Europe. We're not, hoping to see the EU collapse and getting out of NATO and all that stuff that I think people fear.
But for instance, that kind of stories we hear all the time about the Russian-Trump ties. There was a very recent case of Michael Flynn. You were writing about that. So how it's seen, how we can assess what we really know? What are the myths and what are the facts?
It's very difficult to tell what the myth and what the facts are right now. It's funny, one of the things you said I was traveling a few weeks ago in the Baltic. It was in the Balkans, not the Baltics, but you get the sense in Washington that it's even more difficult to tell what's going on than actually being slightly outside of it. We are so inundated with the news, and the story of Michael Flynn in particular has been a very difficult one to parse. Where the information is coming from, what the sort of fights inside the White House are, and how policy is being sort of formulated. But I do think, to Lorne's point, it's the most important thing to pay attention to. It's actually something John McCain said, I think at Munich, that with this president, he says a lot of things, but it's most important to pay attention to what is actually being done, to pay attention to the actions rather than the tweets, as it were.
But what is already done, isn't it enough to assess?
Well, there hasn't been much action yet, except for some appointments which have been mentioned. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council will have a new one fairly soon. Based on those actions, one can be reasonably comfortable that the policy towards the transatlantic community will remain consistent within this administration. However, there's no question that we watch the news as you do here in Ukraine, and we have a very unusual political situation. We have a very unusual president. It's a man who has some business experience and some campaign experience, but no governing experience, no foreign policy experience. He comes into office largely, I think, unfamiliar with treaty obligations of the United States and no grounding in our relationships with countries around the world, not just in the transatlantic community. Having said, and in addition to that, you see a lot of, he has said many things which raise questions. There really aren't many facts just yet, except his appointments. It's mostly myth, if you're talking about what he's saying, because the interpretation of what he says is closer to myth than it is facts, because there haven't really been any facts coming out yet, except for the appointments and, of course, what those appointees have said. And what they have said should give comfort, I think, to the people who are concerned about transatlantic relations and United States reliability.
And Alina, doesn't it sound way too optimistic?
Well, to be honest with you, I think many Europeans, including Ukrainians, are looking at the administration's statements and are wary of the schizophrenia they're hearing. So on the one hand, we have seen Vice President Pence, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dunford, Secretary of Defense Mattis, Secretary of State Tillerson sort of doing this diplomatic offensive in Europe to reassure our allies. On the other hand, the president is holding a rally at the same time in the United States that's all about economic protectionism, bringing jobs back, manufacturing jobs to the United States. So I think the question that many people are asking is, do these representatives of the administration actually speak for the president, and do they actually have a role in what the policy will be? And I think that remains unclear, largely because a lot of these appointments remain vacant. We don't know what the National Security Council will or will not be able to do until we know who's going to be in charge of it. And with General Flynn's departure, that's still a big question mark.
And Veronika, you're an analyst at Kremlin Watch Program. I'm following it as well. And, when you really look closely, the Kremlin definitely feels more confident with all the remarks. Maybe not the latest remarks of Donald Trump on Crimea, but still. And how it all feels in Prague, and not just, I would speak about Central Europe.
Well, Central Europe has been for quite some time under certain pressure of many disinformation and manipulations that come from the media, from the so-called media sometimes, with very clear pro-Kremlin stances. And even though Donald Trump's and the new administration's remarks and moves are sometimes very chaotic and don't really make much sense to a lot of people, the truth is that the narratives that these pro-Kremlin outlets present to people in the Central Europe are very, very coherent. They see him as some kind of a great ally of Vladimir Putin's. They see him as somebody who is realistic, who takes care of his people, unlike people who govern in the Central Europe, which is very, very strange for us. But since Donald Trump got elected, this is the message that we see in these outlets, and people are under influence of these websites, even though they don't really realize it. I still hope that the fact that the United States have been presumed as a important ally, and that NATO is perceived as an important structure to ensure our security is going to be preserved, even though these messages are coming at us from all sides.
Lorne, I would dare to call you a kind of an insider in the Republican Party. You know the party, and so what is the mood? You know, because what we are following is with the President Trump is still a very different group of people whom he represents in the party, and the Republican Party was very strong on being, I won't say just anti-Russian, but being very tough on Russia. That's not exactly what's happening now. So what are really the feeling, and what can the party do?
Well, I think it is important, the question you asked about the party. And one of the things I have told people before the election and since the election, I said before the election, if Trump loses, these voters are not going away. They're not just going to go back to the farms and the factories. So I do think you can disagree with what he's saying, but he does represent a portion of the American populace. And I think what they are saying is, you know, there's a lot of economic insecurity. We do wonder why we have all these commitments overseas. We're wondering about the effects of free trade. And we want to think through all of these issues. And when it comes down to Europe, then I think essentially what the administration is saying is, number one, we made a 2% agreement that everybody was going to spend 2% of their GDP 3 years ago. How are we doing on that? And the answer is 5 of 28 countries are doing it, including us. And the second thing he says is, the issue in the world right now is terrorism. We would like to see NATO oriented around that. NATO has been doing that for a while. Can they do more? But one thing to remember with Trump is he didn't get elected by accident. He got elected because there are people out there who did not find a candidate they agreed with before who suddenly did.
Damir, and how that could be influence on the attitude towards the United States and on the role of the, of the United States globally?
You know, again, just to piggyback on something Lorne said, one thing that is lost, we've alluded to it a little bit in writing in the magazine, is the extent to which Trump's policies are or at least his statements say, some of the, especially the election rhetoric, is an extension of attitudes that I think President Obama, to a large extent, also held. And again, I mean, it's a much more aggressive and virulent version of that. But again, if you look at sort of Obama's unwillingness to really get America involved after Libya in Syria, again, the sort of idea that hands-off, a much less hands-on approach to the Ukraine question, you see that a lot of these things are, I think, being done or at least talked about in a much sort of more aggressive way by this administration. So, you know, on the one hand, I think it's important for allies to understand that this is is a very real American aspect of the American populace. At the same time, it's not all of America, and it doesn't mean that it will stay that way. It's complicated how American foreign policy gets expressed. So will it have an effect in the short term? You know, probably, but everyone is really very nervous and trying to sort of figure out how things are. But I think in the long term, it'll shake out. It won't be nearly as catastrophic as people perhaps think.
So just to respond to what Damir just said, I used to agree with your judgment that in many ways, in terms of foreign policy, Obama was, you could say, the doorman to Donald Trump. I actually disagree with that now in some ways, because that assumes that there's sort of a grand vision strategy to what the Trump administration is doing on foreign policy. If there is, we have not seen that grand strategy arise yet, whether that be isolationism or protectionism or internationalism, interventionism, whatever you want to describe it as, that is schizophrenic at the moment. And that's because there's a lot of executive orders, there's a lot of rhetoric, but there's very little actually to still be critical of in terms of policy. So if we look at what Trump has done, we started the conversation in terms of foreign policy, the only foreign policy decision that he's made so far is cut TPP. Right, that was one of his first executive orders. That has will give China an upper hand in Asia to dominate the economic markets. It has made his base very happy. But President Obama, for example, was perhaps a reluctant open trade, open free market president, but he did pursue those policies. So I think what we're going to see with Trump is really, really unclear still.
Well, the reason it's unclear, there's only one person who can articulate the president's foreign policy, and that is the President of the United States. And he has not done so yet through any coherent message or document, and there have been indeed contradictions. It is reassuring, as I think we all agree, that his appointments have by and large been traditionalist with respect to their commitments or their ideas about American foreign policy. However, as Alina points out, there was the TPP dismantling or withdrawal. However, I think it remains to be seen just what will be done to re-navigate our trade policies in the region, because that's an open question. And in addition, you know, when you think about his foreign policy, one can be reassured that his attitudes towards China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, they are pretty consistent. Why he has chosen Russia to be outside, to have somewhat more generous view, or at least unstated view for the moment, definitely does raise concern. But at some point, we'll get an articulated foreign policy from the president. And my guess is that the forces around him, the advisors, the established worldview that is held by the leadership of the Republican and Democratic Party will prevail.
Vice President Pence is traveling tomorrow to Brussels, and we're of course waiting for a statement, but in generally, how would you describe the U.S. relations towards Europe, with European Union, with NATO, and also how we, what Europe also can do, wherever we still figure out who is there now besides Angela Merkel.
Yeah, well, I think we still need to realize that even though Donald Trump's remarks differ every day, that the alignment is there, and even though we don't yet know what kind of stance he's going to take towards the European Union itself, I think it might actually help to get on our feet a little, to take more responsibility for our security, because even though his remarks on the NATO and its relevance are sometimes a bit worrying, he does have a point in the fact that we have to spend more money on our own security, and that we do have to take care of ourselves.
Well, if I understood you right, that the fact that they are bringing this question that NATO members are not paying 2% of their GDP beside 4 countries in Europe and the US. So do you think this brings more confidence to the relations between NATO, US, and in generally makes NATO stronger?
Not necessarily for the moment, but I am old enough to remember that we have been asking European countries to pay more for NATO since the late 1970s. It's been 40 years that we've been asking Europeans to pay more. And, understandably, a lot of Europeans said they're not going to leave. We don't have to spend 2%. And again, I go back to the American populace. The American populace looks at Europe, and they may or may not want the kind of welfare and health care and unemployment and, maternal leave and the whole systems that European countries have. But if they did, the Americans couldn't afford it, in part because we're paying so much for defense, in part for Europe. So again, I come back to what he is saying is a result of what he's hearing from people. But I do come back to, we've been asking Europeans for 40 years to pay more for their own defense.
It's not just that we've been asking them to pay more. We have been asking them to fulfill commitments that have been made, which is 2%. And many, almost all but 4 or a handful, have not paid that 2%. So it's not that we want more, it's that the United States is saying, please live up to your commitment.
I think Germany could afford to pay more. They're paying, I think, 1.1 or 1.2% of their GDP for defense. It would add measurably to NATO's capabilities, a deterrent to the Russians. If the Germans, and I don't mean to pick on the Germans, almost everybody can pay more, but it would help.
So do you think it brings good in the long run, these kind of remarks for the stability and the feeling of the security in the region? The countries in the end would pay more because they're afraid of, I don't know, like losing good connection to the US?
Well, look, I think Lorne is absolutely right that a lot of times we overblow what the Trump administration has been saying in the media. The 2% ask has been there for a very long time across Democratic and Republican administrations. So that's not anything new. What we are seeing potentially is a much stronger, or I guess, wary response from Europe. Romania just announced that they're about to meet the 2%, which is a new target for them. Of course, the German response to you, Lorne, would be, well, we do a lot besides spend on 2% of our GDP on defense to support security in Europe, and we do a lot of supporting work on US engagements abroad as well. So there's more that these countries are doing besides paying in that 2% margin.
They need to change the accounting methods.
Well, I'm just saying, I think that's the response you often hear. I'm not saying it's the right one, but that's the response you hear from European countries. But I think what Veronika was bringing up is a really good point, that the upside to all of this, Europeans being worried about the schizophrenia and the chaos in the United States, as is being perceived, I think, is that this may lead Europeans to actually start thinking about their own security instead of relying on the United States to always take that leadership role. Of course, that puts Germany in a really, I think, awkward position as this reluctant leader. But I don't know, Damir, you might have some thoughts on that.
It's one of those things, right? It's one of the oldest questions in Europe is the do you want Germany to rearm properly or not? And I mean, I think that's not. We have this idea that it's a settled question, not a problem at all. I do think that it's still viewed as sort of potentially a scary thing within the framework of a NATO that's strong. But then if for whatever reason, I would say, to answer your question, basically, is that it's an unstable situation. I'm not sure it's necessarily to say that Europe is now going to just come together and buckle up, as a lot of people are saying. I would be skeptical after all these years. All it took was a little bit of browbeating from the American president that the Europeans will now, get to cooperate.
I think they have to face their own domestic politics. Just in Munich recently, where we had all these conversations about the 2%, Romania making its commitment, et cetera. You had the head of the European Commission, Juncker, saying, well, maybe we shouldn't think about defense as the only form of security. Of course, in Germany, people tend to be quite pacifist. And somebody like Merkel or anybody else has to deal with the public opinion. People don't want to invest in defense as the form of security.
And we listen to a short quote from the US Vice President Mike Pence on Ukraine. That was a part of his speech in Munich.
And with regard to Ukraine, we must hold Russia accountable and demand that they honor the Minsk agreements, beginning by de-escalating the violence in eastern Ukraine. And know this, the United States will continue to hold Russia accountable, even as we search for new common ground, which, as you know, President Trump believes can be found.
So it sounded pretty reassuring, and we are coming up to the topic, how pivotal would be the role of Ukraine in transatlantic security, and really there are a lot of expectations and I won't say confidence, vice versa, here in Kyiv. So how would you explain the current role of Ukraine and attitude of the new administration?
If you're asking me, I find the Vice President's quote to be, as you said, very reassuring.
But that's Vice President, not the President.
You can be assured that he did not say that without bouncing the idea off of the President of the United States. He would never say that, I don't think. It's inconceivable to me that this is not the voice of the President or the current administration's point of view. And I find it, as an American, very reassuring, and I would urge you, as a Ukrainian, to also find it reassuring. The details, could get interesting. He also said that we need to find more established common ground. I think the reference was to Russia and to the Kremlin in particular. But I also think that following the last few minutes of conversation here, we need to find common ground. That is, the US and our allies within the transatlantic community also need to find some common ground on definitions with regard to what a proper commitment is. And that will have I think that at the end of the day, that will require significant American leadership to establish that, to work with our allies to find that common ground. And that is a challenge for the President of the United States. Once again, the words of the Vice President I find reassuring. I don't think you would have heard those words coming 2 weeks ago. And as I watch our news at home, I think it's clear to me that there is a progression that is taking place, an evolution of ideas or understanding that is coming out of the White House through, as of now, through administration appointees and the Vice President. And, you know, from time to time, the President will utter something that is reassuring on the transatlantic community. And I find that, again, this evolution is moving in the right direction. And so I do think, let me say this, I am hopeful that the President will soon articulate a policy and also take upon himself the traditional leadership role of the United States that involves a recommitment to the transatlantic community and the alliances, whether they be trade or security, etc., that are involved.
Lorne, the Ukrainian establishment is really searching for these lights, some kind of signs for hope. But really, isn't it just a wishful thinking? And what would you respond?
Oh, I don't think it's wishful thinking at all. I think Jim is right. I think there is thinking going on within the administration about Europe, about Ukraine, about Russia. I think, I worked on transatlantic relations in the very dark days of the first term of the Bush 43 administration. It was tough. But one of the things I used to remind people is instead of focusing on the 15 or 20% of things we disagree on, we ought to focus on the 80 or 85% of things we do agree on. And I think that'd be very healthy. It's not good to have, people saying things about Europe and America. It's the same thing. Europeans saying something about Trump, that doesn't help the relationship. We're all going to have to get past that. The second thing is on Russia itself. I do think you see some evolution. I don't think it is invalid or illegitimate for Washington to say, can we get along with Russia? It's a question that's been asked in the 3 previous administrations, and the answer has been no. In the end, we can't. But we had a relationship with the Soviet Union in the Cold War in a much worse time than we have right now, and it's not illegitimate to say, can we get along better with Russia? We'll have to see if that happens.
I mean, it's, to exactly that point, it's not just that the answer was no. It's the other thing to keep in mind is the historical consistency of the Trump administration even trying to do a reset. Every administration so far since the Cold War has come in, tried to rebuild a relationship with Russia and has failed. I mean, it's not just that the answer is no, it's that interests don't end up aligning. And even a president such as Trump, who really likes to conceptualize or at least talk about very broadly as America as defining interests narrowly, I think you'll find that it's going to be very difficult to actually make it work on the merits. But again, though, to your question about Kyiv and Ukrainians looking at what to expect from this administration, this is just to go back to this dispute we were having about the Obama administration and the Trump administration, the tradition here. I think it's true that this president hasn't laid out a vision yet. We don't have that. But it is important, I think, that he is giving voice to something that many commentators in the US have now noted is this Jacksonian tradition, which is populism. It's this idea that that a certain segment of America likes to not think of in terms of think of much more transactionally and in terms of threats rather than in terms of alliances. Again, this is not the only thread in sort of American foreign policy, but it is one that's rising right now. And I think it is something that Obama was also, I think, reacting to as a politician. So I would say, again, the larger picture, it's unlikely, I think, that the United States will be able to find real common ground with Russia. But at the same time, I do think that relationships with countries will be modulated in a different way, attitudinally, if not necessarily materially. And I think that is something that will be happening with this administration.
I'd like, before we go, we listened to a quote from two quotes from the Ukrainian President Poroshenko. He has just recently made in Munich Security Conference.
Ukraine is the cheapest investment for security of the free world. The tools are all there. Firstly, there is nothing more encouraging for us than the transatlantic community, keeping promises with partners and staying strong in unity and solidarity. Second, there is nothing more sobering for Moscow than the resolve of the West to enforce its limits with firm sanctions. Putin hates Ukraine deeply and sincerely. He denies our distinctive features and unique identity of the Ukrainian people. I know that personally. He keeps stating in public that the Ukrainian identity is part of the more dominant Russian identity.
So there is a general question. In Ukraine, this speech was partly criticized for again and again, threatening the West with their own troubles. We're speaking about Ukraine instead of, suggesting something else. Alina, you've been also following the, attitude towards Ukraine by the administration. So what do you see? How would you describe this attitude at the moment?
Again, I just have to reiterate, it's a bit split and bipolar. On the one hand, we have had in his first public meeting, Secretary of State Tillerson, where he met the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, had a very brief statement, his first public statement since he took office, where he reiterated the commitment to Minsk and sanctions related to Minsk, and then that Russia had to prove itself to the United States they can be a reliable partner. Previously, the administration had not mentioned Minsk at all. They had mentioned Crimea. Sean Spicer mentioned Crimea in a press conference on behalf of the president. So that was a good sign that they're willing to go that step further and acknowledge that there are separate sanctions related to Crimea and Minsk. And honestly, I don't see sanctions going anywhere anytime soon because Europeans are very much committed to sanctions, and I think the United States will stay that way as well. I would add to that Congress has been doing a great deal to try to solidify and codify and legislate the policy towards Ukraine and Russia. We have to remember that the reason why Ukraine received so much support in the last few years from the United States is because there's been bipartisan, unanimous congressional support for that, in terms of financial transfers, in terms of support for defense, training in military, etc. And I think Congress will continue to have a very, very important role. As we speak, there's legislation going through Congress that would seek to codify sanctions. That means that right now, the situation we have in the United States is that the president can just sign an executive order and remove sanctions. Congress is trying to make that much more difficult, and they're trying to put it into law, which means that the president would actually have to apply for every single waiver for sanctions through Congress, and that's going to be very, very difficult to achieve. So I think there are there's a good momentum in the United States for Ukraine. We can't forget about Congress. I think Congress, particularly John McCain, he gave an amazing speech in Munich that was highly, highly praised, very eloquent, really laid out, I think, the foundations of what our foreign policy should be. And I think they're going to continue to push, and they're going to continue to pressure. And we saw that happening once already in the very early days of the administration. Kellyanne Conway floated this idea of easing sanctions. We all remember this. People started panicking. And then that quickly dissipated. And why? Because the immediate reaction from Congress, from McCain, from the majority leader McConnell was, this isn't happening. And you can see the administration is willing to listen to its own party, not just to its base, which may not care that much about Ukraine, to be honest with you. I think the average American is really afraid of ISIS and terrorism. And they're like, Ukraine, that's not really our own national security.
And we keep guessing now not just what is in the US president's mind and what is in the president of Russia mind, but really I would like to suggest to listen to the latest quote of Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Especially it's interesting because just a day before the Kremlin recognized the passports from the separatist so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, which some of the analysts of Russian policy said that it would be a sign that Russia is getting firmer on the issue. So we can listen to.
The contact group has agreed again that on February the 20th, the ceasefire regime will start, and withdrawal of heavy military hardware will also start in the zones where they are supposed to be. We have actively supported this decision and obviously expressed the conviction that this time failure should not be allowed to take place. Let us see how the sides will react to this. We have drawn attention to the fact that the blockade of Donbass in eastern Ukraine, which is now organised by the radicals, is unacceptable. This is the ceasing of railway communication, movement of vehicles, and threats to cut all communication with this region of Ukraine completely, and suggest that to condemn such an approach and require that the blockade should be lifted immediately. Our partners in the Normandy format supported this suggestion.
I'd like to go just beyond Ukraine as well, and to speak more about the rest of Europe, of the Baltics, Central Europe, the Balkans. You know, really how we discussed how the new U.S. administration affects Ukraine-Russian relations, situations here. So, what should we know about you reading, traveling, knowing? So, what should we know?
Yeah. So. My impression is it's a question for Europe and how Europe is going to sort of cohere in the wake of all of this. But it seems to me that the signals of Brexit and then even the Dutch referendum on Ukraine have sent a signal, at least to the Balkans, to the sort of the countries that still haven't entered the European Union and NATO, that that the door is actually closing in a big way. And I imagine, that there are resonances to that in Ukraine as well. And at the same time, the sort of incoherence that we've been describing here about sort of American security policy is also, I think, destabilizing large parts of the Baltics at this point. And so it's a troubling situation. And this is that sort of thing that I was alluding to earlier about whether this kind of stuff will lead to more cohesion or more chaos. My worry is, just sort of empirically reading and traveling, is that it's pretty destabilizing at this point, and that...
Where exactly should we watch?
Well, in the Western Balkans, certainly just watch what's going on in Bosnia and Serbia and Kosovo. I think those are really important to keep an eye out on. Russia's actually involved, not very with a lot of money, but there was that attempted coup in Montenegro that they tried to assassinate the prime minister just on the eve of them joining NATO. The idea there, from what I could at least sort of guess, is that if there's a precedent set in the Balkans specifically about the redrawing of borders, be it in Bosnia, be it in Kosovo, be it even with the question of Albania and the minority in Macedonia, well, then the Russians can then just point and say, well, look, this is just another region. The borders, aren't working. Time to start talking about borders. And then there's a talking point about the possibility to redraw borders, which I think is actually terrible as a precedent. And this is where, more attention from the United States, more security guarantees, I think would go a very long way as far as that goes.
And Veronika, so what are your expectations?
What I am a little worried about is that the sense of uncertainty that comes from the US administration kind of adds up to all the divisive issues in Central European societies. That people don't know what to expect, which draws them more to support populists, to support extremist parties even. And with elections coming up, which are not only in the Western Europe, the ones that everyone talks about, which are the French, the German, but also in the Central Europe, these elections are going to be very important, and there's a certain threat that the powers are going to shift a lot towards more populistic, more extremist governments in Europe. And I hope this is not going to happen. I hope that the policies of Donald Trump's administrations are going to become more stable and more predictable, but nobody really knows that. Another scenario that might be a bit positive is that when people see a person like Donald Trump in power and see that maybe his populist promises do not work as well as they thought, maybe they will lose their appetite for such people in their own governments. which is something I can only hope for.
Alina?
Well, again, there are some upsides to the so-called Trump effect. I mean, we talked about NATO and countries potentially committing more to their own security, but I think the other upside is when you see a lot of instability and uncertainty, as Veronika was saying in other countries, that may make you think twice about wanting to undermine the main source of stability in Europe, which is the European Union. And actually, after Brexit, we saw public opinion polls towards Europe actually be more positive, particularly in countries like Germany, where we've seen a general decline in people's positive assessments of the European Union. Now they've been on the upside. They've been rising across the EU, and particularly in those key Western European countries that are going to have elections this year. But, you know, I really am also concerned. You know, I think 2 months ago, I would not have said that somebody like Le Pen could actually win the presidency in France, mainly because the French have a very specific electoral system that really disadvantages small parties. But now, I actually think she has a very good chance, particularly because of the way the contest is shaping up, with the center-right completely imploding, with the leftists imploding. The problem that we're seeing is not just about people's grievances and them looking to extremist parties to fulfill or answer to their anxieties. It's the fact that the center-left and the center-right have been failing to really address people's real concerns about their own future, whether it be security, economic, cultural identity concerns. And I think until we see a centrist leader who's able to take up those reins and come up with a new narrative for Europe that is more encompassing, that doesn't ring shallow, like Europe whole, free, and peace, well, that sounds great. To the new generation who are involved in that process, that's meaningless when everything else is falling apart. And I think a lot of times, to be honest with you, European officials from the EU, from Brussels, sound a bit out of touch with what's actually happening in their own countries.
So, of course, we all would love to have more predictability, but that's not, that won't be the position just to wait, you know, what Trump will do, what Putin will do. So if we speak about the safeguarding transatlantic security in the region. So what are exactly the things which could be done if we just, you know, do something, consider, I'm speaking about the policymakers, about analysts who are not just sitting and waiting what the, what would be unexpected scenarios?
One thing's important to remember. Again, I'm old enough, I don't quite remember the Eisenhower administration, but there are many administrations where you've had trouble between the US and Europe, the Suez Crisis, Skybolt with Kennedy, when we started negotiating with the Soviet Union in the 1970s with Nixon, et cetera, et cetera. It's really important not to just watch things happen, but to be in touch for I think, Trump to visit Europe, for European officials to come to Washington and try to figure out how to fix these issues that have come up. I think it's very, very important. The one area where you might want to wait and see is relations with Russia, because I think Putin is congenitally incapable of not overreaching. He does it every single time with every single administration, and you're already seeing it with this administration, with flybys around our aircraft and things like this. Who knows why he's doing that? But it's really, really important for US and European officials to be in close touch. We've had patches going all the way back to the 50s that have been rough, and we've been able to work it out before.
Jim?
Well, let me go back to something that Alina mentioned, or actually that has been mentioned by everybody, I think. And this issue of populism, this lack of unity, this division, concerns about economic upheaval, and the uncertainty that Veronika mentioned, that didn't start with Donald Trump. I mean, we've had that for years, long before Donald Trump even announced for presidency. You've seen it in Europe, and you've seen, you know, division within the transatlantic community. To get to your question about what needs to be done, I think first the leadership within the transatlantic community, not just the United States, obviously, the leadership needs to recommit itself to a certain set of values, a certain set of principles. And they need to recommit to the notion of the community itself and the importance that that community represents to the preservation, to the protection of those values and our way of life in the transatlantic community. And part of that is recognizing, of course, the threats outside of that community. In this case, let's say, I think we would all agree that the number one threat, perhaps outside of economy, is the Kremlin. And I think that part of that, part of the answer to your question is we need to come up with a common strategy with dealing with the Kremlin and its threats. I don't think we're that far away from it, to be perfectly honest. And I do think that he has a tendency to overreach. He's done it many times. Perhaps that recommitment can come organically, or perhaps it will come as a result of an urgent situation. I don't know. But I do believe that it will come.
Veronika, I'm very curious to see, do you see these chances, so there would be a different kind of leadership, which would be more in touch in Europe?
That's a good question. I think even the European leaders, as of leaders of the European Union, should maybe change a little the way they react to the new administration, because we've seen some historical reactions to each one of his remarks, even though they didn't even happen eventually. You know, these things he planned to do. We've seen a very historical reaction to the potential naming of the new ambassador to the European Union. And I think those people need to realize that we still need to speak to the United States, that we still need to perceive them as a partner, and not to exaggerate every single thing he says or tweets, and maybe react more calmly and perceive his policy, be more patient towards what he's actually going to do.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think you have to look beyond the tweets. And the long-term strategic view about the United States will remain a key leader in the world order, no matter what. Just given our economic capacity and our defense capacity, all of these things are not going away. But just going back to the concrete problems here and what can be done. What Jim said about all of us agreeing that the number one threat to security, transatlantic security, is the Kremlin. I think experts do agree with that. Defense Secretary Mattis agrees with that. The entire, I think, intelligence community agrees with that in the United States. All military leaders agree with that. However, the American people and Europeans do not agree with that. Poll after poll after poll shows that Russia is somewhere down the list of what is perceived as the top threat. The top threat, Islamic terrorism, ISIS, those kinds of security questions, which is, of course, why we're seeing what we're seeing in Europe today in regards to refugees and this conflation of refugees with terrorists. So why are we seeing this gap between what policymakers are saying and what the public actually thinks, right? And what can we do to fill that gap? And I think that what we can do to fill that gap, and I mean policymakers, is that there needs to be a better investment in strategic communications, how policymakers communicate with their publics. What Donald Trump did well, that I think the Democrats have not quite come to terms with, is that he actually went out to those communities. Why did many Polish Americans and Ukrainian Americans vote for Donald Trump? Because he actually took their invitation, shockingly, and went to speak to their diaspora communities, right? Hillary Clinton actually didn't do that. And I think that helped to win the presidency. And I think until European politicians and EU policymakers get down to the business of holding town halls, communicating, putting out message, being on message, and not being all over the place and chaotic, we're not going to see this gap filled.
So, Damir, your final remark on what we need to do.
No, I think that's exactly right what Alina is saying there. Let me just say it a slightly different way. The challenge is that what Donald Trump and what populism represents is in some ways hostile to what we like to express as the West's values. For example, the question of migrants and the questions of identity. Whereas we like to think of Western values as universal. So trying to be sort of exclusive on these things is very difficult. Your president's remarks, again, sort of, we're talking in terms of these very generic values, and I do think that it probably is not the best way, again, to approach this administration. At the same time, it's important that we do not abandon these values for political expediency, but in fact, what Alina was talking about is figure out a means of addressing what people actually are worried about, but at the same time talking about these things that do bring us together. It can't just be merely a recommitment to the values. It needs to be a political recasting of the European project, perhaps, really thinking about what has brought us together, but then addressing the real problems of the voters.
Thanks a lot to all of you. I'm pretty sure we get a bit more understanding of what's happening and what we could do to safeguard transatlantic security. So we had Lorne from the Transatlantic Renewal project, Alina Polyakova from the Atlantic Council, Veronika Víchová from the Kremlin Watch Program, Damir Marusic from the American Interest Online, and James Denton from the World Affairs magazine. Thanks a lot, and follow us on our webpage, Twitter, social networks. We are working for you all the time.